She is a Bay Area treasure, and she's made her home here for a long time, and I'm so honored and grateful to bring our last storyteller this afternoon, Joyce Maynard.
I know there are many events going on this afternoon, but don't you think we're at the coolest one?
Yeah.
And who else has sort of the aromas as we're having the stories? So this one goes back, starts 31 years ago. It's March of 1982. I'm married to the man I was married to then, although things were already looking difficult, feeling difficult. I had one 4-year-old daughter, and I was 8 months and 27 days pregnant. We were living in a little cabin at the end of a very long dirt road, about 5 miles outside of a very small town, and the snow was deep. We had planned on a home birth, and in fact, our daughter had been born at home with a midwife. But this particular night, my husband, it was a very cozy kind of night. I was baking brownies, and my husband was watching the Boston Celtics. It was during the glory days of the Boston Celtics. Larry Bird was doing what Larry Bird does best, or did best, or what we know of that he did best. And my husband was whooping and cheering, and the phone rings, and it's a call from the West Coast, from British Columbia, where my father lived, to say, from a hospital in British Columbia, to say that my father, who had been a recovering alcoholic on the wagon for some time, had fallen off the wagon, had gotten a very serious case of pneumonia and was now dying. And he was not going to make it through the night. He was in an oxygen tank. There was no thought of being able to speak to him. He was not conscious or reachable. I put down the phone, and I felt the sickest and most desperate that I have felt in my entire life. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to scream. I did cry, wail, moan, pace, gag, tremble. And I sat on the toilet. I got up from the toilet. I sat on the toilet. I got up from the toilet. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to drink water. I wanted to spit water out. And I was shaking and shaking and shaking and gasping for breath and wishing I was dead. And finally lay down on the bed and trembling so violently that my husband actually lay down on top of me just to steady my vibrating body. And it was only at that moment that I heard, coming from some very deep place in me, a sound that I had only heard from myself one other time, and that was when I was in the final stages of giving birth to and pushing out our daughter. And I looked and I felt, and sure enough, our baby's head was crowning. I had completely, for the women here, or the men who have been around some women here who've given birth, you may recognize that in fact what I had just experienced was transition of labor, and that what might normally be stretched out, not still particularly comfortably, over 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours, had been compacted into about 10 minutes. So they were 10 pretty intense minutes. And there was no thought to getting the midwife there in time. But at this moment, Steve, my husband, said, I'll be back in a minute. I'm just going to have a cigarette. And I said, no, you need to be right here, right now. And one thing that you didn't do with Steve, he had many fine qualities, but you didn't tell him what you thought he should do. He would then be only more entrenched than ever in doing what he thought he should do. So he said to me, Joyce, you're getting hysterical. And he walked out of the room, and I followed behind him on the floor, kind of grasping at my crotch to keep the baby in, and crawling past him, calling out to him. And I do have this searing memory, too searing, of his boot sort of saying, Joyce, calm down. It'll just take a minute. I'll be right back. I think this is the moment that I will mention that my husband wasn't actually a smoker. He was one of those, at least, he was one of those people who had a cigarette every 6 weeks, but this happened to be the moment. So he had a cigarette, I guess, out in the snow. I doubt very strongly that he enjoyed it. And somehow I managed to hold off until he returned. And when he did a couple of things. He checked for the baby's cord around the neck, and there was one mighty push, and our son, Charlie, was born. 10-pound baby boy, pink and healthy and wailing, and everything looked really good. We crawled into bed, or he crawled into bed, exhausted, and the next morning our daughter, who was 4, came downstairs and saw the tuft of hair sticking out from the covers and said, "Oh, my dreams came true." And that day was the first of probably many hundreds of times that I heard the story told, the revised story told of how Charlie was born. And the revised story featured Steve as the heroic solo father who had checked for the cord around the neck and delivered this wonderful, healthy baby with no assistance from any midwife. And I have to say that I began to tell this story too. The story became a part of our family mythology, the night that Charlie was born, the night that Steve delivered Charlie, the night that Steve checked for the cord around the neck and everything was fine, and Audrey said, "My dream came true." And I have to say that although I told the story, and it was a beloved story, people asked, "How did you ever do that, Steve?" And he said, "Oh, I'd read the fireman's emergency manual. Really, people make too big a deal about this. It's not that big thing to pull off. You just check for the cord around the neck." But every time I would hear my husband or my children tell this story, I felt as if my mouth was full of maggots. I felt this bile come up in me, and this bitterness, and I guess I have to say rage. I think it would be difficult to name one event or one moment that brought about the end of my marriage, and you won't be surprised to know that I'm not married to that man anymore and haven't been for 25 years. But I do name that night, the night of Charlie's birth and Steve's cigarette, as a turning point in our relationship, a moment from which we never fully recovered. I used to beg him to apologize. And as I've already mentioned, Steve was not a man who liked to be told what you thought he should do. So the apology did not come. And the marriage eventually ended, not for some years. There was another whole baby in there. Charlie was 7, and my son Will 5, my daughter 11, when our marriage ended. But the story continued to live on and be told, and retold, and retold, and retold. And as I went on with my life as a parent and a writer, I told many stories. I became somewhat known as a teller of difficult stories and somebody who talked about things that other people didn't talk about. But this remained almost uniquely among my life experiences, one I did not tell about. Actually, there was another one that I had not told about. But I moved to Marin County, actually, which probably to some degree explained my freedom from some old New Hampshire, New England silence keeping. And so I decided to write a memoir, and to actually, finally, at the age of 44, speak some truths that I had kept silent a very long and unhealthily long amount of time. And, the ones, there were some that were more sort of obviously controversial, but of all the events of my life about which I struggled in the writing of that book, the one that stood out most for me had to do with the night of Charlie's birth. And I'll say here that I think, with all respect to this fine male writer and father here, that I have observed over the years that one distinguishing characteristic between women writers and a lot of male writers is that the man is going to be the writer first. He will not sacrifice his work for being the sweeter and more thoughtful dad, and he'll be celebrated for it, for being so unblinkingly, unflinchingly, courageously honest. But there is an expectation placed on women to put their children first. And probably, had I actually truly believed that it would have been a terrible thing for my son Charlie for me to tell that story in my book, I would have chosen protecting my son over telling the full story, although it would have been a painful one, because in fact that was a very pivotal moment in my life. But actually, while it might not have been a story to tell to a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old, my son Charlie by this time was 15 years old. And you know, although he had been protected from the truth about the night of his birth, he had most certainly not been protected from our divorce or my anger and bitterness towards his father. That he knew full well and had suffered from, no doubt, a fair amount. And I thought at this moment, actually, the memory came to me of an experience that I used to have, and probably many of us around my age, I'll be 60 in 2 weeks, as I've been announcing everywhere I go. Probably those of us this age can remember that, you know how there'd be a child in your class who was adopted, and your parents would say to you, he's adopted, but don't tell him. And even as a child, it seemed so wrong, so unfair, that I should be in possession of this crucial information about a person that he didn't have about his own self. And I actually felt somewhat that way about the story of Charlie's birth, that it was a piece of information that would help him make sense of his parents' sadly tormented, angry relationship. And so, but one thing I did not want to do was have my son read it in a book, were he to read my books, which hasn't happened yet, but no doubt after I die, they'll take them all down off the shelf. And I actually did the exact opposite of what I do at an event like this, or when I'm writing a novel, or writing an essay, or performing at the Moth. I wanted to strip the story of all emotion and color and tell it as flatly as I could. And I wanted to choose for the location and timing of this story the moment that the place that I bet parents of teenagers have used in their own lives, in your own lives, when you've got something difficult you want to say to your child, and you don't want him to escape in the car on the freeway. Then I wouldn't have to look at him, I wouldn't be able to look at him, he wouldn't be able to look at me, and he couldn't get out. So I was driving up 101, and I have to tell you that I struggled weeks over this event. It was a long time before the morning came when I told myself, this is the day I am going to tell Charlie the story. And we passed the exit for Paradise Drive and Lucky Drive, and we're going closer and closer to San Rafael, where his school was, and I hadn't told him the story, and I'm gripping the wheel, and there was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I'm a little bit nauseous. And I say, you know, Charlie, there's something that I wanted to put in my book, but I wanted to tell you first and just hear your thoughts about it. And then I said, in a pretty sort of dry way, so you know, the night that you were born, it looked like my dad was going to die. My father did not die that night, as it turned out. And I was feeling really sick, and it turned out that actually you were being born, and your dad wanted to have a cigarette, and I really didn't want him to, but he did anyway, and he left, and I felt really mad, and I never told you that. And I probably said a few other things. And my son, and I felt my whole body just sort of like this, and my son let out a wry laugh, and he said, well, that sure sounds like Dad. And incidentally, he loves his dad. As well he should, for reasons that have nothing to do with thinking that he'd be a good guy to be alone in a cabin in New Hampshire with giving birth. And you know, that book was published 15 years ago this fall, although there's a brand new edition out with some new thoughts of mine on the topic of telling the truth. And people made a huge fuss about some of the secrets that I violated. Nobody mentioned that story. But really, what I believe is that the truth doesn't sink your boat, it floats you out to sea.